Right now, somewhere in the world, a package is arriving at your door from somewhere you'll never visit. You don't think about the hands that touched it. You don't think about the borders it crossed or the deserts it traveled. You expect it to arrive on time, and it does. But for most of human history, this was impossible. Trade moved at the speed of a camel. Information moved at the speed of a horse. And only one empire had figured out how to make both move together across an entire continent. That empire was China, not Rome, not Persia, not the Ottomans who came centuries later. It was the Tang dynasty between the 7th and 10th centuries that cracked the code on something that sounds simple but changed everything. They didn't invent the Silk Road, but they transformed it from a dangerous collection of isolated desert routes into the first true network of global commerce. And they did it by understanding something your brain knows but rarely acts on. Connection is more valuable than conquest. When most people hear Silk Road, they picture a single path, like a highway stretching from Beijing to Rome. That's wrong. The Silk Road was never a road. It was a web. Thousands of smaller routes, some following mountain passes, others hugging river valleys, a few cutting straight across uninhabitable desert. Merchants rarely traveled the whole thing. A Chinese trader might move goods only as far as Samarkand. There, another trader would take over, moving those same goods further west. Information passed the same way, hand to hand, merchant to merchant, each stopping at oasis towns to eat, sleep, and gossip. What made this network revolutionary was that someone, the Tang, realized that the real money wasn't in the goods themselves. It was in the infrastructure, in the security, in the guarantee that if you sent a bolt of silk west, it wouldn't be stolen in the desert by bandits. If you sent that silk far enough, it would actually arrive. The Tang dynasty understood taxation in a way that felt counterintuitive then and still does now. They didn't try to control every transaction. Instead, they taxed the passage itself. A merchant caravan moving through Tang territory paid a small fee. In return, the Tang provided something that sounds boring but was revolutionary: safety. They had cavalry. They had way stations with fresh horses and water. They had information networks that told them where bandits were operating and when a merchant was in danger. This sounds obvious now because we take it for granted every time we buy something online. A company takes a small cut, Amazon, eBay, whoever, and in return handles the risk and the logistics. The Tang invented that model 1,400 years before the internet existed. But here's what gets strange. The Tang didn't control all the Silk Road. They couldn't. Persia controlled the western section. The Sogdians, a merchant people famous for their linguistic abilities and cunning, controlled the middle. The Tang only held the east and center. What mattered was that the Tang controlled the highest value section, the one closest to production. They sat on top of the world's most advanced economy. China in the 7th century wasn't just making silk, they were making paper, ceramics, tea, porcelain. These were luxury goods with no equivalent in the West. Roman emperors were paying in gold just to get access to Chinese silk. That asymmetry of value meant the Tang controlled the entire conversation. A researcher named Valerie Hansen spent decades studying the documents left behind by merchants and officials who operated on the Silk Road. What she found was that the Tang didn't monopolize trade through force alone. They monopolized it through information. They maintained detailed records of which merchant companies were trustworthy. They communicated across thousands of miles about who had damaged goods in transit and who was a fraud. They created what we would now call a reputation system. If you cheated on the Silk Road, everyone knew it within months. Your business was finished. That worked because the Tang enforced it. Cheat a merchant under Tang protection and the cavalry came looking for you. This seems brutal now, and it was. But compared to what trade looked like before, it was a revolution in trust. Before the Tang stabilized the Silk Road, merchants traveled in massive armed caravans. They had to hire soldiers. They had to bribe local rulers. They had to negotiate with every kingdom they passed through for permission to exist. The costs ate up all the profit. The Tang changed this equation by doing something that sounds like common sense but required genius to pull off across such vast distances. They standardized the rules. No matter which oasis town you stopped at, the taxation rate was the same. No matter which Tang official you encountered, the treatment was the same. Predictability doesn't sound exciting, but it was the foundation of everything that followed. Show us something surprising. Archaeological excavations in the Taklamakan Desert have found letters written by merchants, and they sound almost like emails. One merchant named Zhang complains to another that the roads are too dangerous and asks if the other guy knows of a safer route. Another letter discusses quality control for jade shipments. A third is a receipt for taxes paid at a border crossing. These are the voices of ordinary people trying to make a living, and they're expressing frustrations that don't sound that different from what a FedEx truck driver might say today. The technology changed, but the human problem stayed the same. How do you move goods safely across distance? How do you trust people you've never met? What's wild is that the Tang understood they weren't powerful enough to control everything that happened on the Silk Road. They were smart enough to know it. Instead of trying to police every mile of desert, they created nodes, cities and towns where merchants could stop, trade, rest, and most importantly, resolve disputes. The city of Chang'an, which is modern-day Xi'an, became the largest city in the world at that time. Historian Mark Edward Lewis has documented that Chang'an had a population of nearly 2 million people. That's bigger than any European city would be for another 1,000 years. A huge portion of those people were foreign traders, Persians, Sogdians, Arabs, Indians, all living in special quarters, operating their own shops, marrying into local families, converting some to Buddhism and Christianity. Chang'an became the first truly cosmopolitan city on Earth. But here's the reframe. The Silk Road wasn't really about silk. By some estimates, silk made up less than half of what was actually traded. What was moving was ideas. Buddhism entered China through the Silk Road. Chinese mathematics and astronomy reached the Islamic world. Chess came west. Gunpowder eventually traveled east. The real commodity was knowledge, and the Tang understood that the merchants carrying goods were also carrying information. A trader who had been to Samarkand knew things about markets and politics that were worth money. A trader who had seen how Persians built their caravanserais knew things about architecture that could be useful. The Tang didn't just tax goods, they were harvesting intelligence. This is why the Tang invested so heavily in infrastructure. Way stations weren't just about fresh horses, they were information hubs. Officials stationed there kept records, took notes, and reported back to the capital about everything they observed. What languages were people speaking? Which merchants were getting rich? What new technologies were people using? Were there any signs of trouble? This was industrial-scale information gathering, and the capital had systems in place to process it. The Tang bureaucracy was legendary for its attention to detail and its ability to move information upward through hierarchies. By controlling the Silk Road, they weren't just getting rich, they were getting smarter. They were learning what was happening on the other side of the world in real time. The thing that eventually broke the system wasn't force or competition, it was nature. In the 10th century, climate patterns shifted. The deserts expanded. Water sources that had sustained caravans for centuries dried up. The routes became harder to travel. Meanwhile, maritime trade was improving, ships became more reliable, navigational instruments got better. The sea route from China to the Middle East and beyond became safer and more profitable than the land route. The Silk Road didn't disappear, but it stopped being the primary way goods moved between civilizations. The Tang's grip on trade loosened, and eventually their empire fell too, replaced by others. But the infrastructure they built, the reputation systems they created, the cosmopolitan cities they established, those didn't disappear. They were copied, they were improved. They became the template for how trade works. You might think this is ancient history, irrelevant to how the world works today. But here's what's wild. The systems you use every single day are built on the Tang's blueprint. When you buy something on Amazon, you're using infrastructure that someone maintains for a cut of the profit, just like the Tang taxed the caravans. When you check a seller's ratings and reviews before buying, you're using the reputation system that the Tang invented by keeping records of trustworthy merchants. When you wait for your package to arrive and it does, on time and intact, you're experiencing the result of someone, somewhere, having implemented standardized procedures and predictable rules. The Tang didn't invent commerce. They invented networked commerce. They invented the idea that a massive system of trade could work not through conquest but through trust. The remarkable thing about studying the Silk Road is that it reveals how